Hello and welcome to the Filmumentaries podcast. This is Jamie Benning talking to you from Kurtz's camp here in southeast London. It's July 2021. I'm in the middle of my F1 season at work. And excitingly, I had the opportunity to direct the Porsche Super Cup race last weekend. It was a little bit out of my comfort zone, but something that I look forward to doing more of, for sure. And interestingly, Michael Fassbender, yes, he of movies, was a guest driver. He's a bit of a Porsche nut. So I can now say that I've directed a TV show starring Michael Fassbender, which is pretty cool. Cheers to my mate Tony Ellis at F1 for giving me the opportunity to do something a bit new. It's been a while. So cheers, Tony. Really appreciate it. Keep doing what you're doing, mate. You're doing an awesome job. Thanks also to all of you that contacted me with nice comments about episodes 28 and 29. That was with art director Roger Christian. That's the man who found the lightsabers and also dressed the sets for the original Star Wars and was the art director, standby art director on Alien. And also with title designer Dan Perry, whose book I've just ordered. I'm quite excited about that. It was my birthday recently and I had a bit of money left over. So I've decided to order myself that book. And you can find that at danperry.com. I'm not being paid to say this. I just think it happens to look really awesome. And I think you'll enjoy it too, because you're like me, surely. And I always appreciate your feedback. It lets me know I'm on the right track. And it's good to know you're listening and enjoying the podcast, because it is just me here in my little office. And, you know, I'm trying to put this together in the best way that I can. So it's really nice to know that people are having fun listening to it. Please make sure you subscribe and you comment and leave a review and tell your friends, because that's how it's going to get out there a bit more. Thanks as always to those of you supporting me on Patreon, patreon.com/Jamie Benning. For as little as $1 per episode, and I only release 2 a month, you can make all the difference to me doing these. It is work, and I consider it work as well as a hobby. And it does take up a lot of time. In fact, you can actually put a $1 cap on it per month if you want. So for $12 a year, you get over 24 hours of Filmumentary podcast goodness. So have a think about that. You know, if you'd be willing to buy me a pint or a coffee if you met me, here in London at least, it's probably going to cost you $12. But you get a year of podcasts for that. Patreon is a really good system because if you've enjoyed the podcast and you can afford to help it continue by donating, then you can. If you can't afford it, then that's fine, because some nice folks out there who can afford it are doing just that. It's a system based on kindness and soundness, and who doesn't need a bit of that at the moment? Okay, so for this episode, number 30, I have a real treat here for you. Now, when I started doing the podcast, after losing, 80-90% of my work in early 2020, as so many of us did in the freelance world, I didn't really know what I was walking into. Could I get enough guests to even get past 5 episodes? Who would I be able to interview? But through, a bit of hard work and some good fortune and kindness of others, I should point out, I've been able to talk to, and I hope you'll agree, some pretty good guests so far. But this time, I have a bona fide film legend. If you don't know the name Walter Murch, just break off now, go and Google it. Or you can head back to episode 27, in which I spoke to a gentleman, John Lefkowitz, about his free documentary about Walter Murch. If you do know who Walter is, you'll know what a coup it is to get him on the podcast. He's a veteran of some of the most highly regarded movies of the past 50 years, THX 1138, American Graffiti, Godfather, the trilogy, Apocalypse Now. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Walter is an Oscar-winning sound designer. In fact, that term was coined for him back in the 70s. It never existed before, and now there are sound designers everywhere. He's also an Oscar-winning editor. He's an author, a philosopher. He's a translator. He's a keen interest in science, and genuinely is somebody I would listen to all day, given the opportunity. I was lucky enough to have about 2 hours with him over 2 days, the second part of which we only talked about his directorial debut, Return to Oz. Yes, that scary mid-80s kids movie. Was it a kids movie? That'll be a bonus episode in the coming weeks. And for this episode, I talked to him about the rest of his career, as well as some upcoming projects. I brought this episode forward because, I was excited to get it out there. So if you hear me talking about interviewing Gary Rydstrom, I should let you know that that episode will come out next month, August 2021. So here's my conversation with film legend Walter Murch, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. So Walter, when did you first realise the power of editing?
Probably when I was 10, and it was through audio only. I'd gotten fascinated with tape recorders, which were new on the scene in the early 50s. And a friend of mine had one because his father had it for dictation or something. And I would go over to his house and let's play with a tape recorder. And eventually that passion translated into getting one of those for our family. My pitch was, we won't have to buy records anymore. We could just record off the radio. So it was piracy before the term of it, I guess. But I quickly discovered, as young people do with technology, you can cut this and you can tape it in a different order than you recorded it. And then you can slow it down and speed it up and play it backwards and, upside down. So that informed myself. I immediately gravitated to that, so which says something about who I am, and, which was a surprise to me, but, it's the kind of thing you do in your pre-teens, like building model airplanes or something. I never thought that this would, I'd wind up doing this, 67 years later. So.
You went to USC, so what were the circumstances that lit that fire under that group of you there that made you think you could do what you've ended up doing outside of Hollywood and not conforming to the systems that were in place?
Mostly trying to avoid going to Vietnam. Most of us had graduated from university and we were ripe for the plucking by the Army. And I went to the draft and I got my card and I was just waiting to be inducted. And if you stayed in school at that time, you were deferred until you were out of school. And so I looked around and I'd studied for a year in Paris at the Sorbonne. I was studying Romance languages and history of art. But 1963 was kind of the high water mark of the Nouvelle tsunami wave. And so I got interested in film, not really connecting it yet with what I'd been doing at age 10. That was to come. And at that time, there were 3 film schools in the United States, only 3, amazingly. USC, UCLA in Los Angeles, both of them, and then NYU. I grew up in New York, so I and my new bride, Aggie, we just gotten married in the summer of '65, and we motorcycled across the country to go to film school. She is a nurse trained in England, and she got a job at the University Medical Center. So that's what we were doing. And it was, I was already interested in film, but I think if you lifted the carpet and said, well, why are you really here? The urgency of that was stay in school. After a while, they started drafting students, but not married students. And then after a while, they started drafting married students, but not students with children. And so we didn't have a kid in order to get out of it, but we were always one step ahead. And then finally, they realized how ridiculous it was, and it became the lottery system. And then I could have been drafted, but I just, by the luck of the draw, literally, I was not. Having said that, that's kind of the nuts and bolts of a reason. But the other reason is that that generation of kids who were us was the first generation to grow up with film in the home, thanks to television. And so we were familiar with it in a sense because it was a member of the family. And so the idea of going to film school, it was not as silly or absurd as it might have been 10 years earlier. I mean, there were people who went to film school then, but very, very few. So why was there a sudden surge? I think that's the reason. And myself and many of the other students were interested more in global cinema than American cinema. There were few like John Milius who were definitely interested in Hollywood, but most of us were, more intrigued by what was going on in European cinema or Japanese cinema, Indian cinema, and I think if you look at the kind of films that we started making in the early 70s, they have more of a European feel. The Godfather is kind of, when Bob Evans wanted to hit us with a stick, he would say, "This film is too European. You've got to make it for the American audience." And we said, "Go away, Bob." I didn't say that, but Francis did. And but there's an aesthetic there that was trying to fuse global cinema with Hollywood. We weren't in Hollywood. We were in San Francisco, which is sort of an outpost of Europe in California. So that's the more noble reason for why we were all there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that European feel to THX, to American Graffiti, even though the subject is very American and the hot rods and the teenagers, it has that European feel of it because of the way it's directed as a sort of observer, almost in a documentary style.
It was George was very influenced by Fellini's I Vitelloni, and that's who those kids are. They're the Vitelloni of Modesto, California.
Just winding back a minute to THX 1138, what was George's remit for the soundscape of THX? Was he very much on board with, the ideas that you came up with, or did he leave it to you? Was that a particularly collaborative?
We had worked together on 3 or 4 films at USC, including THX, the student film, and we were just of the same mind about what sound could do, especially at that time, given a science fiction subject matter where you don't have a huge amount of money. How do you create a world? Well, partly you create it through camera work and very inventive production design, but also through unusual sound backgrounds to create the sense. What we would tell ourselves was, this isn't a film about the future, it's a film from the future. Just in the same way that a Japanese film made for Japanese is a film from Japan, it's not about Japan. And so and George had originally intended to shoot THX in Japan for exactly that reason. But the budget wouldn't allow that, so we shot it in San Francisco and LA a little bit.
Yeah, it definitely feels like a film about another culture. Well, it is ultimately, but you do feel like an alien. It's like, I've been to Japan, and you kind of had that feeling where you look around and everything is slightly different, slightly off kilter. And it's interesting how your work on the sound in THX, that you can see the through line to Star Wars. You've got that radio chatter with the kind of tonal dissonance. You've got the prods from the police, kind of cattle prods, are kind of prototype lightsabers, I think you've said before.
And the the TIE fighters are the motorcycles.
Yeah. Yeah, clearly you had a big influence on Ben Burtt's work
Yeah.
in Star Wars. Yeah, you can definitely see that through line. And I spoke to Gary Rydstrom just a couple of days ago, and it seems the three of you really do have this kind of through line to, kind of had the opportunity that you had on THX and Ben had on Star Wars, that he had it on, I guess, Jurassic Park, you would say, to come up with something new and something never heard before.
Yeah.
The dialogue and music and sound effects in THX are very kind of interchangeable, which is kind of the only modern example I can think of that particularly in sci-fi is the newer Blade Runner 2049, where the music and the dialogue and the sound effects sort of occupy one space, as it were. You had that kind of smearing of effects. Do you think your non-union approach gave you that greater flexibility in your early work there?
Yeah, definitely. That's one of the reasons we all moved out of Los Angeles to San Francisco, was to get away from the very fine divisions in union jobs in Los Angeles. So you can't do that. We have to hire this other guy to come in. And in San Francisco, there was a union, but as far as they were concerned, anyone who worked in post-production film they were in that basket. So you could be an editor, a film editor, or a sound editor, or a sound mixer, or a visual effects. It didn't matter. And, we exploited that as young people would to the maximum. And there was splashback ultimately, because that's what happened retroactively to unions in Los Angeles. All of those fine divisions that were in place in the mid-60s, early 70s are now gone.
You clearly have a very incredible memory for sound, I guess. Do you have a mental library of sound and what sounds connect to certain kind of emotional reactions? Because I think, I heard you describe THX, something in THX having the sound of lace. You kind of were doing this with your hand, and I wondered if you kind of file sounds in a visual way as well.
Yeah, visual and tactile. I mean, the hearing is an extension of touch, and that's one of the things when you're thinking about what sounds could we use for this scene. The danger is thinking about the center of the scene, because that just kind of locks you into the barrel of the scene. But what's more important is to think of the transition from the previous scene to this new scene. How do you want that? Because that's where the audience is going to be most aware of the sound envelope. Once they get into the scene, then they're interested in the dialogue and but as you cross from one scene to another, you have the opportunity to present to the audience a new fabric, and that's I think I can't quite remember, but that's where the lace or the tweed or silk or whatever metaphor came, which is mentally run your hand across the transition between scene A and scene B, and you want the sound in scene A to be silky and slightly chilly, and then when you get to scene B, it's tweed and it's rough and it's warm. And then with that in mind, okay, what sounds are warm, rough and soft and warm and thick kind of sounds.
Yeah, I think I was watching Cold Mountain last night, and you referred to that tweed and silk analogy there, right. In there, yeah. The Godfather, then, I suppose, where are we now? 1970, 71, 72?
71.
Yeah, so having witnessed the kind of commercial failure of THX, was there pressure on you to now kind of fit more conventionally into what remained of the Hollywood system? Or did Francis still give you that kind of, flexibility and space for creativity?
Definitely the latter. I mean, that was his fight, which he succeeded in terms of the photography and the period of the film and the casting of the film and what we talked about earlier, the Europeanization of the film, and the music, Nino Rota. So I was insulated from that. There was no pressure on me. There was pressure on Francis, but he had his way. He has a certain kind of Jedi mind trick ability to convince people that this is what you're doing. It's that what do they call Steve Jobs? The reality bending ability.
Yeah, he really does, doesn't he? Yeah. I went to that lecture you did in Primrose Hill the other night where we briefly chatted, and I always love that story you tell about the using sound as a metaphor, a tool for metaphor, and
Right.
The example you gave that night, of course, was the Godfather Michael Corleone scene where he kills the Sollozzo brothers. And what was amazing about that is that then you showed that other YouTube video that kind of revealed an element that you didn't know was there. Could you just tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in New York, about 2 miles from that restaurant, so I knew the neighborhood, and it's a long scene, 6-minute scene ultimately, I think, something like that, and perhaps half of it is in Italian with no subtitles. Think of that, especially in 1972. And the intention was to be realistic and to throw the audience a curve, which is you don't understand Italian, but you can understand what's going on by paying attention to body language and acting and facial expression and camera work and sound. We're going to help you, but we're not going to serve it to you pre-digested. You're going to have to do a little work here. And that adds to the tension of the scene. And the other reason for not having any music in that scene, which another director might have immediately leapt to that decision, is that there was an upcoming big music cue as Michael Corleone runs out of the restaurant. Very operatic. And that was going to take the film into an intermission. As originally conceived, the film was, 3 hours long almost. And any film at that time that was over 2 hours and 20 minutes had to have an intermission. And The Godfather was the first film to break that rule. And that was Bob Evans's decision. He said, I remember, we don't want to let the audience off the hook. We've got them, and if there's an intermission, we're going to let them go. And so he nixed the idea of an intermission. So anyway, but that was the reason not to have any music, was to give more impact to music when it did come in. But can we do something music-ish here? And that was where the idea of that part of the Bronx I knew was full of elevated subways. They're not subways anymore, they're elevated trains, but they make a peculiar kind of sound when they're on this huge instrument, which is the steel girders of this elevated track. So I thought, well, we could record that and bring it in and take it away and bring it in and take it away, and then gradually, like waves, make it more and more intense until finally it's at maximum intensity just before Michael decides to shoot. And that was the pitch. Francis said, great. What he didn't tell me was that restaurant was in fact right next to an elevated train. And that was what I discovered just, 15 months ago or so, via a YouTube video, that went to that location and did a pan from the whatever it is now. It's a fabric store, I think, which went out of business. Now it's nothing, but you pan from that to the trains. And I wrote to Chris Newman, who's the sound recordist on Godfather, and I said, wait a minute. And he wrote me a very nice long letter saying, yeah, I heard that this location would be problematical, and it turned out to be right next to an elevated train, and I was doing everything I could to minimize it. But we would wait for the train to pass, and Francis would look at me, and I would listen. Okay, go. And Francis would say, action, with no slate. The scene would happen, everyone praying that the train wouldn't come back. But on some takes it did. So he was, when he saw the film, he never came to the mix. We were in LA, he was in New York, and he went to watch the film, and he thought, wait a minute, there's a sum. I got rid of all those. And but it's the typical kind of push-pull that goes on between post-production sound and production sound. What's fascinating in retrospect is that the presence of those trains was baked into the performances of all the actors in some weird way, because they're waiting for the train to come back, and it's adding something to the intensity of the performances. And then we did this backflip. What's another interpretation of the scene now is that Clemenza had told Michael, when you come out of the bathroom, come out blasting. And he doesn't. He comes out of the bathroom and there's that kind of weird close-up of him where he looks sort of slightly goofy. And then he goes and sits down, but the sound of the train is dying down at that point. And then he sits there waiting for the sound to get big again, so that when the sound is as loud as it can be, that's when he pulls the trigger to mask the sound of the gun so that people out on the street won't hear the pistol. So that's another interpretation of it. There's a wonderful story in the New York Times back when Mario Puzo died, where they interviewed a hitman for the mafia, and that sound convinced him that Mario Puzo was in the mafia, because the hitman said, when I killed my first hit, that was the sound I heard in my head, that rushing sound of blood as I pulled the trigger for the first time. And only somebody who did that would know psychologically that fact. So.
That's fascinating. I mean, there really is, I can tell from the email exchange we've had and the things you put in the bottom of each of your emails, you're somebody who really enjoys these connections, whether we understand them or not. And I think that is a really fascinating one, isn't it? And what Al Pacino does with his face in that scene as well is...
Yeah, it's his eyes.
Oh, and the chin, like... It looks like he's either got dry mouth or there's too much saliva in his mouth.
Yeah. What's fascinating is compare that performance to that now famous shot of Derek Chauvin, the man who was accused of murdering, the policeman accused of murdering Floyd.
Yeah.
When he hears that he's guilty, his eyes are doing exactly the same thing that Michael Corleone's eyes are doing. I finished Godfather, and it was the success of Godfather that gave Francis the clout to be producer on American Graffiti. Everyone had turned the film down, and it was only the success of The Godfather. So Graffiti was shot the summer after Godfather had come out. I was working on Conversation. I was editing Conversation at the same time as I was mixing American Graffiti.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting how those two films connect in a way, because I've listened to a lot of your stuff, Walter, about how you would do the worldizing of sounds for American Graffiti, where you might have 3 recordings that you were kind of manipulating independently and together to come up with the results that you needed. So can you just describe what worldizing is, and then I guess how that informed the kind of story in the conversation in a way?
Yes, worldizing is a term that I came up with at the time to allow me to create real world reverberation around a sound that doesn't have it. In other words, you take a human voice, for instance, and record it normally, but you want it to seem like it's in a a football stadium. So what do? Back then, there was not much you could do. Now we have an infinite array of possibilities. But then there was just an echo chamber, and some of them were kind of funky because they were expensive. And so what I decided to do was to take the sound of the voice, the recording of the voice, to the football stadium, and another recorder play that recording in that space to give it a nice football stadium feel, very distant echo, and then capture that on another recorder, and then put those 2 tracks together so that in the mix you could decide, well, add a little bit more slap echo or take some of it out. When we moved to the close-up, take out it gave us flexibility. And that's what we did with all of the music in American Graffiti to allow us to have the dialogue, in this case, be upfront and focused. And the music, at the beginning of the scene, let's say the music is very in your face. And then as the scene begins, we take the music and we push it way into the background, whatever the background is, through the use of these 3 separate recordings. And now the ear hears the dialogue in crisp focus in the foreground, and the music can actually be played fairly loud, but because it has no sharp edges to it anymore, the ear doesn't have to struggle. If you're familiar with focus in photography, that's the same thing. When you're taking a portrait of somebody, you use a long lens, 85 millimeter or greater, get their face in focus, and that throws the background out of focus so that the eye knows exactly what it's supposed to look at. This is the audio equivalent exactly of that, of deep focus. Being able to manipulate the background, the focus of the background to the moment on a moment-by-moment basis.
Yeah, I watched American Graffiti again recently, and it's amazing how what you did acoustically in that acoustic space with the sound, how it pulls you into sort of experiencing those nights out on the street with the cast.
Right, especially when you remember that the original mix for that was in mono. Not in stereo, and it still has that effect in mono. Of that, it spatializes even though all of the sound is just coming out of one speaker. There was I don't know, it's not funny, but it's Verna Fields, the editor of Jaws. This is before she edited Jaws. Worked with George and Marcia to get the first assembly of the film, a 3-hour cut of American Graffiti. And but then she had to go back to LA to work on something, and she took me aside and said, "Walter, I'm really worried about the film because of all this music. People are going to go crazy. The audiences are going to say, turn off the fucking music after a while. Tell George to get rid of half of the music." And I said, well, Verna, thank you. She was one of my teachers at film school. And I said, Verna, thank you, but we have a plan. I didn't say worldizing because I hadn't invented the term at that time, but I said we have a plan to allow the dialogue to be in focus and the music not to bother people. She went away shaking her head, but it worked.
Did you get a reaction from her after the film was released?
No.
I guess because at that point, nobody had really had that approach of having that many tracks commercial tracks in a film.
There were, whatever it was, 28 songs. Universal was outraged at the cost of those 28 songs, which was $80,000. You can imagine what that would be 10 years later even, let alone what it would be now. And they said, we can get some musicians in, we'll do sound-alikes, which was a conventional low-budget approach. You get people to imitate the Drifters. And George said, absolutely not. And he was right.
And then that work you did on American Graffiti kind of informs the Harry Cool character in the conversation. We see him manipulating those 3 dials there. Was that your first job actually as editor of the picture?
First job editing a feature film, yeah. I'd edited commercials and documentaries previously, but not a feature. Certainly not a feature by the man who had just directed The Godfather. So there was, if conversation didn't work, then who would they blame? It would be this inexperienced film editor.
And I can just imagine it. Well, I suppose we describe it as meta these days. You've got a sound editor and editor editing a picture about a man who works in sound and is editing sound. Were there any moments you had there where you just kind of forgot who was Harry and who was Walter?
Yeah, sure. Especially at 3:00 in the morning. Yeah. I was working on a chem flatbed, and on the screen would be Harry manipulating the tapes, and he would press stop, and at 3:00 in the morning I would say, well, why is the film still running? He pressed stop. But it was, because I was looking at hands on the screen of somebody pressing stop, and right in front of me were the controllers that I would press to stop the film, and I no longer saw the difference between those two things. But that was the reason Francis hired me, because he said, Harry is a sound recordist, you're a sound recordist, so you know the character, and that's your in. That's how you get into the film.
Well, we've reached about the halfway point of my conversation with Walter Murch. We'll be back after these short messages.
Here's what some people are saying about the Projection Booth podcast.
This podcast takes no shortcut in producing outstanding content. How they haven't become more widely recognized is beyond me.
I love this show. Smart commentary, in-depth interviews, and great production.
It's obvious how serious these guys take their podcast and bring that next level of professionalism that anyone would be hard-pressed to match.
There are few things better in life than listening to people who are both passionate and knowledgeable about their subject matter. The Projection Booth, with their wide and wild range of film discussions, is one of those things. Simple as that.
The Projection Booth is the highest quality film podcast around. I love the focus on cult films, witty, informative banter, and amazing interviews. The Projection Booth is the best podcast out there, if you're a serious film lover.
The Projection Booth Podcast, with new episodes available every week at projectionboothpodcast.com.
Be
you tired of pop culture podcasts where the hosts exist in a constant, blissful state of agreement? Well, fear not. Let me introduce you to the Chinstroker versus Punter podcast. Mike is an ex-film student with a penchant for David Lynch, and Paul is your man on the street who likes what he knows and knows what he likes. Join us fortnightly as we discuss what we've been watching from our own very different perspectives. You can find us at csvsp.libsyn.com. Chinstroker vs. Punter is a proud member of the Pod Syndicate family of podcasts.
If you want to get involved in the filmmaking industry but don't know where to start, check out raindance.org. Raindance is not only a film festival, but also somewhere that you can sign up for training and courses in subjects like acting, directing, producing. There are short courses and full-time degrees, and if you quote Jamie10, that's JAMIE10, you can get 10% off. So check out raindance.org to see what catches your eye, and maybe you'll get that job you've always dreamed of. And then maybe you can come on the podcast. And it's often said, isn't it, that the film is found in the editing process, but I think the conversation is a prime example of that, as you've described many times. I was fascinated to find out that story that you told about the sequence where the girl that Harry sleeps with was going to steal the plans for the microphone, and then you kind of switched to another idea, and how you went about filming that. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, there were... The screenplay of Conversation had 3 plots. There was Harry recording these tapes. There was Harry and his relationship with his professional rivals, which had nothing to do with the recording of those specific tapes. And then there was a whole subplot which is completely gone out of the film, which was the fact that Harry owned the apartment building in which he lived, and there was a whole series of discussions with the other tenants of the building who were complaining about the maintenance of the building, and they didn't know he owned the building, and so they elected him to go talk to the lawyer about fixing the water heaters, that kind of stuff. There's no trace of that left in the film. And the other problem that the film had is that Francis stopped shooting with, I forget, 67 scenes unshot. He just ran out of time and he had to go do Godfather 2. So he said, well, cut it together the best way you can, and then we'll see what the problems are, and we'll go and reshoot something if we need to. So under that pressure, I thought, why don't we fuse Harry's professional rivals with the subterfuge of the people ordering the recording, which ultimately results in murder. And Harry invites a bunch of his colleagues from a convention to come back to his lab, and among those is a girl who demonstrates products at the convention. Her name is Meredith, and she comes on to Harry, and there's an argument. Everyone else leaves. She stays. They sleep together, and Harry wakes up at 3 o'clock in the morning. She's gone, and he walks over to his bench, and in the screenplay, he discovered that the plans for his special microphone had been stolen. And, that shows the infamy of his professional colleagues. But I thought, well, why doesn't she just steal the tapes? And, pitched it to Francis. He thought, okay, good idea. And we had to shoot a shot in which the tapes were revealed to have been stolen, empty boxes. And that was what we shot down in Los Angeles. As it turned out, to save money, we piggybacked on another film shooting at the same time at Paramount and built a little set against a wall on their set, and then borrowed one of their B cameras in between takes to shoot Gene Hackman's brother shoulder looking at a tape recorder and finding out that the tape has been stolen, and also the three other, the source tapes are gone as well. So that means that Meredith was a plant. You know, it was like a spy movie. She slept with the guy and stole the goods. And that allowed us to condense a whole lot of other material. The funny story about the shoot was that, as you know, I think we did 2 or 3 takes. It was a very simple shot. And at the end of the 3rd take, the director and the star of that movie came over to watch what we were doing. And if we had kept the camera rolling, we could have panned off of Harry Call onto Jack Nicholson and Roman Polanski, because the film was Chinatown. So Conversation and Chinatown could have found a merge point there.
I'd love to see that. That's another film that I'm kind of fascinated with, just where it sits kind of in the history of film. Another film, of course, that is massive in your catalogue, and I'm only going to ask you one question about it, Walter, is Apocalypse Now, because we can, you know, again, we could talk 5 days just about that. What I wanted to know was, because you've been in the industry long enough to go from the physical film medium through to the digital age, but you look at that opening sequence in Apocalypse Now. How did you manage to achieve so accurately and effectively those dissolves in that opening scene, given that you were probably on a flatbed or a moviola or something like that?
Yeah, I was working on a chem, a flatbed, and the chem is modular. And what I did was get 3 picture heads, and that left me with 1 sound head. So I could play 3 pictures at the same time. And I built what you would call an A, B, and C roll, and pushed start. And then I would kind of stand back and look at all 3 screens with my 3 eyes, imagining what the dissolves might be like, drawing grease pencil marks on them. I would make changes in that, and when I got it roughly where I wanted it, this is in 1978, I made U-matic tapes, 3/4 inch tapes of each of those rolls, and then went up to Francis's office, and Francis had a video switcher up there, very crude by today's standards, but you could play 3 tapes back and record on a 4th. And so then I would go up and do the video switching from A to B to C to B to A to B to C, you know, all of that. Recorded on a 4th tape, show it to Francis. He would have ideas. Then I would go back down, make changes to the film, repeat the process. And then to preview the film, we did a reverse telecine of the U-matic back onto 35 millimeter film.
Oh, wow.
You can imagine what that looked like.
Yeah.
But, you know, it gave the idea. And that was, when we did the final optical, it was another nerve-wracking experience, because everything was fluid for whatever it is, you know, 6 minutes. You couldn't stop. Click, 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 click. But that's what it is in the end. That's what you see.
Amazing that Francis sort of had the foresight to have like a video switcher in his array of equipment. He's somebody who's always enjoyed the kind of the latest technology, because I know there's a company I work for, because I'm in television. You just kind of described my job there, switching between A and B and C. He worked with our company, or one of the companies I work for, using a video switcher that would allow you to set up different scenarios, different camera scenarios. So you go from one scene to the next. So he shot this kind of like live film. I don't know how successful it was, but you know, he always seemed to be somebody who's very, very much at the kind of cutting edge of what is possible.
Always has been,
yeah. The transition from physical film to digital, Did you, because Cold Mountain was the first film that you used Final Cut Pro on, I think, wasn't it? Or was the first film that Final Cut Pro had been used for a feature picture?
No, the other features had done it. It was the first big budget film that did it.
Okay. I just wondered if there was ever kind of a thought in your mind that, you know, in the film world, you think, well, it's a good idea, but it's not worth the kind of destructive nature of what you have to do to edit a film. Did you find moving into that digital realm that it just kind of gave you more possibilities and gave you more flexibility? Or did you still try and... the decision that you make if you're going to cut a piece of film, you're going to make sure you get it exactly right before you make that cut. But in the digital realm, you can just give it a go. You can give it half a go. You don't have to be precise because you can always easily undo it. Has that changed the way you approach your editing?
No, I still do it the old way, as if I'm editing film. But I'm very open and always have been. You know, I'm like Francis in that I'm an early adopter type person. In fact, the first time I ever met Francis was I was editing a commercial in Los Angeles, and George Lucas and Francis came by and said, "Walter, come up the street." This was on Seward Street in Hollywood. "We're going to look at a computerized editing system." This is 1968. And it's the CMX system. And so we went 2 blocks up the street to see this system, and we all decided this is the future, this is how it's going to go, obviously. I think it was black and white, the screen was about that big, and you could at most deal with 5 minutes at a time on hard drives that looked like washing machines, using disks that were this big. I actually, at Francis's encouraging, drew up a workflow for how we could edit The Godfather on the CMX system, 1971. So only 3 years after that, Paramount, correctly, of course, turned it down. But we were pushing at the gate very actively, and it was. My first feature film editing on the Avid, in this case, was English Patient. And that was the first film to win an Oscar for editing on a film edited electronically. So I jump into the pool without wondering quite how many alligators there are in there. But I have a knife with me, just in case.
Yeah, it's interesting that you've kind of won awards and acclaim for each of the platforms that kind of existed and exists out there. Our paths actually very, very briefly crossed when I worked for a company called London Editing Machines, and you were editing Cold Mountain up at the old chapel. And I walked in there one day and they said, this customer has a standing desk. He's very particular about he likes to stand. And I remember walking into that room and you had all of the snapshots of the scenes on the right hand side and the preview monitor on the left, and then your architect's table. Or why do you stand when you edit? Is it something about the freedom it gives you to step back and have distance from it?
Yeah, it's a mixture of things. It's healthier for you. I mean, there are all kinds of articles online, your chair is your enemy. And certainly in the last 10 years or so, there's been a proliferation of standing desks because it is healthier for you. But I began editing on the Moviola, which is a standing, or at least the way I used it, you stood at it and you had the rewind desk and then you just turned and did the Moviola, and you could jump around the room. Whereas when you're sitting, you're kind of stuck a bit, and I didn't like that. So I would always stand at the Moviola, and that just baked in that feeling. And I loved the flatbed editors when they came in, the Steenbecks and the Chems in the early 70s in the United States, but you sat at them, and I developed what I called Steenbeck neck, which is basically the only thing that you move is your wrist. You're just sitting there going like this. I mean, it's much worse now with digital editing. But with a moviola, you're doing all of these kind of big arm movements and rewinding and pulling trims out, and so that you're getting a lot of exercise. And it was sometime in the mid 80s, I think, on Unbearable Lightness of Being, where I looked at the chem and I said, wait a minute, the chem is just a rewind table, except it's horizontal. The reels are horizontal, not vertical. So put it up at the same bench height, and I built 2 plywood boxes, 15 inches tall, and put the chem up on that, and I thought, this is great, and I've been doing it ever since. Huh. It's also there's the term kinesthetics, which is the kinesthesia, your sense of your whole body. And when you're sitting, basically you're a paraplegic. Your legs are not operative. When you're standing, the whole body is an instrument, and you're feeling the rhythms with the whole body. That's the reason that conductors stand to conduct. They could sit down to conduct, but they have to stand. So there's that element to it. And the other thing is just one of the things that they've discovered just in the last 4 or 5 years is that it was known that we have 2 circulatory systems. There's the heart, lung, blood system, and there's the lymphatic system. And the lymphatic system is the system that pumps fluid around the body in between the cells to clean out the junk that accumulates. So it's a trash collector, basically. It's not, you have to have blood going to your cells on if you hold your breath for 20, 30 seconds, you feel like trouble. And so you have a dedicated pump to make sure that it happens. The garbage collecting lymphatic system is not seconds critical. It's kind of day critical, hourly critical. So the system doesn't need a dedicated pump. What it does is it depends on the large muscles of your body to flex and to send this fluid all around your body. The largest muscles in your body are your legs. And even when you're standing, even when you're standing still, rather, your legs are flexing. So the other weird thing is that they've only discovered, as I was saying, in the last 4 years, that the lymphatic system is actually connected to your brain. They thought, up until 2016, I think, that there was no connection, the blood-brain barrier. And it was a medical student, graduate student at the University of Virginia Medical School, who discovered in mice that, wait a minute, what's that? He discovered the tube that connects the lymphatic system to the mouse's brain. And he said, men, mice, same thing. And so he got a couple of willing cadavers and started probing around. There it is. And so now they have to redraw all the anatomy textbooks, which they thought had been a fixed item as of 1920. Now, 100 years later, there is a connection. So it's good for your brain to have the have the lymphatic system circulating all over your body. So
good advice.
Lots of reasons.
Yeah, I used to fly a lot for my job. I worked with I still do work with Formula One, so I was flying around the world doing races every other week, and I actually changed my meal on the plane to come earlier than everyone else's. Like I just picked a gluten-free one, so I could get up and walk around the plane while everyone else was sitting, because the last thing I wanted to do was be sat down for that long. I also edit standing up, interestingly.
Very good.
You clearly have an interest in the sciences and in music. Obviously, you have your translation work as well. How does that inform your choices in the edit. Do you think all of this stuff is kind of cross-pollinating?
Yeah, must do.
Yeah.
You know, I certainly with translation, you know, when we edit, there is a chatter going on in our brains. Should I use this shot or that shot? Well, if I use that shot, then I have to replace the other shot. But it's worth it because that moment, and if I do that, then I can do this, and no, I can't do that. You know, it's all of that. Your hands are doing something, obviously, editing, but your brain is very active in that mode. And what I found in translating is that it's exactly the same process, because I like to say that an editor is translating from the language of text, which is the screenplay, to the language of images and sound in time. And a picture is worth 1,000 words, but a word is worth 1,000 pictures, depending. And the editor is constantly navigating those efficiencies the way a translator navigates between the different efficiencies in languages. There is no word for shallow in French, for instance. And there's no word for the day after tomorrow in English. In other languages there is. So operationally, one of the things I do at the end of a film when suddenly you're cut adrift is I take out the books and I start translating things, which gives me a soft landing. Basically, my brain is still doing the same kind of thing, but there's a tapering going on. So I do that as a kind of recreation, in order to avoid the shock of suddenly not working anymore.
Yeah, it seems to me that, you know, as we sort of advance even further down into the digital realm, you've clearly got one foot in the kind of analog world at all times, which obviously makes you very skilled at what you do. I wanted to talk about Coup 53 as well, which I watched the other night, which I found absolutely fascinating, not only from the subject, but from its construction and some of the story you told behind it at Primrose Hill the other night. Well, what criteria kind of informed your decision to get involved in a project like that?
I had met Taghi in 2012 in New York, and I was editing another documentary, Particle Fever, about the search at CERN in Geneva for the Higgs boson. Luckily, we found it, but the film was started before anyone knew that what would happen. And an investor in that film was also an early investor in Taghi Amirani's film Coup 53, which he was just at that point getting underway. He graduated in physics from Nottingham University, so we talked physics. He helped our film get into the Sheffield Documentary Festival. It had been turned down by Cannes and Venice and everybody. And that it won the audience award at Sheffield, Particle Fever, and then it got into Telluride and blah, blah, blah. So, and he was raising money principally from people in Silicon Valley, and we live just north of San Francisco, so he would come and stay with us, go down to Silicon Valley, shake the can. He'd come back, we'd count the pennies, but I never thought that I would work on the film. But I had been working on Tomorrowland, Brad Bird's science fiction film, until they fired me because Disney wasn't happy with the film, and the editor is usually one of the first people to walk the plank under those circumstances. So I was in that cut adrift state, and Taghi and Aggie, my wife, put their heads together and said, why don't you go to London and work on this little documentary for 6 months about the history of the coup in Iran. I already knew about the coup because of working on Sam Mendes's film Jarhead, which is about Middle Eastern oil. And so here I am 6 years later. 6 months turned into 6 years.
Wow. I saw in the film, we see those coloured shapes on the wall, and I think there's even a sequence of you kind of cutting them out and writing on them. Is that kind of like a paper edit, or like a...
Yeah.
Yeah. And you've got a whole... Clearly you have a whole language developed there in terms of colour and shape and everything else. Is that something you've been doing for a number of years?
Yeah. No, since, I don't know, we started doing it on THX, so it's 50 years old. Yeah. Each card is a scene, and there are a couple of words written on the card that give a thumbnail description of the scene, and then the size of the card tells how long the scene might be, and the colors indicate, is it action, is it thoughtful, is it does everything turn around this scene? In that case, I turn the card and change it into a diamond shape. What I call elbow scenes, where everything leads to this and then you go off in another direction. So yeah, that's how we wrote the film.
And you are credited as writer on that film as well, along with Taggy. Yeah. I heard you say once before about you didn't like the idea of footage kind of piling up, on another film. I can't remember which one it was, but when you entered working on Coup 53, how many hours of footage were you walking into there?
Not that much.
Oh, really?
I think when I started in 2015, he'd collected, he'd shot interviews and he'd collected archive. It was probably 40 hours. But over the next 4 years, we eventually maxed out at 532 hours of material, which is a personal best for me.
Yes.
That's the most I've ever had to deal with.
Just want to give people a chance to find out how to see it. So if you want to just let them know where to go.
Yeah, it's you can buy a ticket. I think it's now £5 or something at coup53.com. It's a controversial film for all kinds of reasons. We screened the film at Telluride, that was its premiere, and sold out. Sony Pictures came over after the screening and said, "Great, let's talk," and then they went cold, and that experience was repeated over and over and over again, of people who were very interested in the film, but then something happens and they go quiet. Mostly they don't even say no, they just disappear. We call it the Coup 53 fade. And we were threatened with defamatory lawsuits of defamation by Brian Lapping and Norma Percy, very esteemed British documentarians who made End of Empire, which was one of a 14-part series that we drew from. It's a long story. In the end, there was no basis for the lawsuit, and we fought it legally, and it wasn't dismissed because it never happened. But they forced us to take the film offline because ITV then withdrew. The threat of the lawsuit made ITV withdraw permission for 14 minutes of crucial archive, which they eventually gave us. So it's about the U.S. and Britain complicity in killing democracy in Iran in 1953 and installing basically a dictator in the form of the Shah of Iran, who moved from constitutional monarch to absolute monarch. For 25 years, the Secret Service that he employed and the other severe restrictions that were used to quiet dissent eventually boiled over in 1979, and the pendulum swung to the Islamic Republic, which is basically where things are today. So there's an argument to be made that if Britain and the U.S. had not done what they did in 1953, the situation in the Middle East would be vastly different than it is today. So anyway, that's Britain has not admitted officially that anything like this ever happened. And so there is a reluctance to confront this issue here officially. And part of the resistance to distributing the film or showing it on television is this: no, we don't talk about that. Because in our film, we have the prize of the film is the testimony of an MI6 agent, Norman Derbyshire, who went rogue, in a sense, and gave an interview recorded on tape and transcribed, never used by this End of Empire program, in which he admitted that, yes, this was the truth, and he wrote the plan for the coup, and he directed the coup by radio from Cyprus through his agents on the ground. And, you know, this is an accusation that needs ultimately to be confronted by the British government.
Yeah.
We distributed the film in using VOD, video on demand, linked to willing theaters and other organizations. So, and we split the proceeds. So you would go to a theater near you, and there are sites on our website, and say, I want to see this film. You pay the money, and then you get the film to download. The theater gets half, and we get half. And that was the model, and the film got fantastic reviews. It was reviewed by everybody from the Telegraph to the Financial Times to the Morning Star to the Daily Mail to the Evening Standard and the American equivalent of all this, 100% positive reviews. So it's a peculiar situation. I mean, I've never had a film get as good reviews as this film, and yet nobody is willing to distribute it. So there's a paradox there, which we're still dealing with. It's being shown in France right now at a festival, and we'll see.
Great. Well, hopefully my listeners will support you and Taggy's investment in this and get out there and see the film either in a cinema or on their home systems. Yeah. Just have one final question, Walter, because I'm aware that we've hit an hour and something here. I was quite excited to hear you mention you're in the process of writing a new book at the moment, because so many of us will have read your In the Blink of an Eye, which ends, in 92, 93, was it out?
That was, it's Blink was first published almost 30 years ago. Yeah.
Mm. And does the new book continue on from there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Blink almost exclusively talks about editing, and this book called Suddenly Something Clicked talks about sound mixing, sound recording, directing, writing. Basically, it covers much more ground than that, and I'm in the middle of writing it. In fact, the chapter I'm writing at the moment is about standing to edit. Basically, the things that we just talked about are what is in that chapter.
And without putting any pressure on you, when can we expect to see the new book?
I'm guessing this time next year.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much for giving your time, Walter. And from everyone on this side of filmmaking, thanks for everything you do, because
sure.
I think what's amazing about you, Walter, is that not only have you had such an impact on the sort of film culture, but being able to educate the audience as well, I think, is a really important part of that. So, yeah, thanks for everything you've done.
All right, you bet.
Sorry, just having a cup of tea there. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Walter Murch. After we conducted this interview, Walter got in touch and asked if I got what I wanted. And I replied saying, well, of course I had so many other questions, Walter, but I was aware that we only had a certain limit of time. And he said, well, what else would you like to talk about? And I said, well, I didn't talk to you about Return to Oz. So he got back to me saying, well, let's do it next week. So the following Monday, We zoomed again for about 45 minutes about his film and his experiences making it. And as I said in the intro, I'll put that out as a little bonus episode next month, August 2021. Coming up on the podcast, I have my conversation with director John Patrick Shanley, sound designer Gary Rydstrom. Tomorrow I'm speaking with the very talented Gabriel Hardman, comic and storyboard artist. I've also been in touch with Howard Kazanjian again. His book is due out in August. I think actually September here in the UK. So he wanted me to, of course, read the book before I interview him. So hopefully I'll be doing that soon. I've also got in touch with a couple of big names. A very well-known Oscar-winning director who is tentatively interested, and I'm trying to convince him at the moment. And a cinematographer who's pretty high profile, actually. Worked on some pretty awesome movies. So fingers crossed. He said yes, but we're just trying to figure out a date. And also a special effects guru. Now you're probably thinking Dennis Muren, John Dykstra. I've actually managed to get in touch with Douglas Trumbull. Now he hasn't replied yet, but I'm hoping that he does. Hopefully he'll get back to me soon. More on that later, hopefully. Another guest that I've mentioned that's been coming up for a while, and we're still trying to fix a new date. I unfortunately had to cancel because something came up, is Colin Gowdy. I don't know whether it's Gowdy or Goody. I'm going to have to ask him this. But I did actually meet him. He kindly invited me out for his birthday drinks. He was down visiting in London and got together with a group of friends, some editors, some special effects people, some directors, and I had a lovely evening sat in Green Park out in the open in safety, having a drink and a chat for the first time in what feels like an age, meeting new people and just getting myself involved in some really interesting conversations. So thanks to Colin for that, and hopefully he'll be on the podcast soon because he's such a lovely guy and he's so talented. He's so good at what he does. I just want to kind of pick his brains and see what's going on in there. I'm also planning to run a competition for just my patrons in the coming weeks with some pretty cool prizes, actually. So if you want a chance of winning, if you're already a patron, you don't have to do anything. You're already in the mix. If you do want to get an entry, you have to become a patron. So you've currently got about a 1 in 55 chance of winning. So keep your eyes on Twitter at JamieSWB for more info on that later on. Thanks for listening, and I hope you can join me again for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.
My name is Harry Call. Can you hear me?